Hey, folks, welcome to another episode of Cutter One. I am your host, Jay Just Jay, your resident troublemaker and your resident culture warrior. I hope you are all doing well as we head on into Thursday. Yeah, we're edging closer to the weekend, thank the Lord, or whatever deity you choose to worship. All right, so let's get right into it. Just checking out this article. I hope you all enjoyed that five-parter that I did on the other day on Tuesday. It was interesting. I felt like it needed to be packaged in that way because it sort of drove home the point. Like individually, I could have done a video on each of those stories individually and just focused in on that particular story, but it was just because of the timing and because everything came out literally within hours of each other, over a 72-hour span. It was hard to not want to talk about the fact and not want to draw attention to the fact that, like, this is a concerted effort, right? This is not a random thing. Like, Collider's going to do their thing and Screen Rant's going to do their thing. Like, this is a concerted effort, right? Like, it's not coincidence when you see that many articles sort of all aligned with the overall same narrative come out. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed that. If the situation warrants me pointing out more instances like that, I will do so. But I just wanted to bring that to people's attention because I thought it was a rather telling situation. But anyway, let's get right into it with this latest article, and this is coming to us from the good folks over at MovieWeb, and this is another Kyle Kriska. All right, that's given us this one, Kyle Kriska, and it's why the Hobbit films aren't as beloved as the Lord of the Rings. The Hobbit movies were massive box office hits, but they have not developed the same kind of long-term adoration as the Lord of the Rings. All right, let's see what Kyle has to say. It says the land of Middle Earth from The Lord of the Rings is one of the most famous fantasy worlds ever. I'm sorry, I had to pause that. Is one of the most famous fantasy worlds ever put to the page. The works of J.R.R. Tolkien have been long beloved as some of the best fantasy stories of the modern age. There have been numerous adaptations of Tolkien's works over the years, ranging from Ralph Bakshi's animated take on The Lord of the Rings in the late 70s to Peter Jackson's live-action trilogy of the films from the early 2000s. One group of Lord of the Rings films that doesn't get the same amount of love as many of the others are the three films based on The Hobbit. First published in 1937, The Hobbit was the first story set in Middle-earth that Tolkien ever released. It tells the story of a hobbit named Bilbo Baggins who is swept off on an unexpected adventure with the wizard Gandalf and a ragtag group of dwarves who hope to reclaim their home of Erebor, the Lonely Mountain. The Hobbit was almost instantly beloved as an outstanding work of fantasy, and it was because of its success that Tolkien was able to publish his further Middle-earth stories, such as The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion. After Jackson's The Lord of the Rings films were a sensation, there was immediate interest in seeing an adaptation of The Hobbit, which would serve as a prequel to those films. Fans got their wish in the early 2010s when, instead of one Hobbit movie, Jackson delivered a trilogy of films based on the book. It's been nearly a decade since those three movies, An Unexpected Journey, The Desolation of Smaug, and The Battle of the Five Armies, were released, and it's clear to see that they don't receive the same consistent adoration as the Lord of the Rings movies. Here's why that is. Now, before we even get into it, and I haven't read this article ahead of time, I guarantee you a lot of their reasons for The Hobbit not being held as in as much esteem as the original Lord of the Rings trilogy that Peter Jackson did. I guarantee you a lot of those reasons are also going to be reasons that apply to why people don't like the Rings of Pewter. Okay, I'm just speculating. Again, I haven't read the article ahead of time, but we'll find out. But watch, I think you guys will probably see that there will be things that they attribute to The Hobbit and reasons for The Hobbit not doing well with audiences that, if you stop and think about it, are the exact same things that are applying to the Rings of Pewter. But let's get into it. How the material was adapted. There's no denying that the Hobbit novel is an exciting, well conceived, and plainly fun adventure story that is considered a classic for a reason. However, it's also a much shorter book than The Lord of the Rings, which can be a problem when trying to pull a trilogy of movies out of it. The Lord of the Rings already had 3 books to adapt, totaling over 1,000 pages of material. The Hobbit, on the other hand, is only about 300 pages. That's shorter than each of the 3 Lord of the Rings books individually. Granted, they did also pull from the supplementary material to The Hobbit that is provided in the appendices at the end of the Return of the King book. That material further details Gandalf's affairs throughout the story of The Hobbit and also provides more of a backstory for the dwarves, the woodland realm of the elves, and more. However, even with the additional material, it's clear to see that The Hobbit was being squeezed for every ounce of story possible in order to develop 3 films. To quote the elderly Bilbo from The Fellowship of the Ring, it feels thin, sort of stretched, like butter scraped over too much bread. With the Hobbit trilogy, Warner Brothers and New Line Cinema were attempting to recreate the massive success of the Lord of the Rings films. They wanted to mimic the same kind of grand and fantastical adventure with world-altering stakes. The only issue with that is that The Hobbit is a very different kind of story than the Lord of the Rings. In attempting to make films with the same kind of stakes and epic story as the Lord of the Rings, the studio ended up losing so much about what makes The Hobbit work in the first place. While Bilbo and his dwarven company do unknowingly play a key role in the larger story of Middle-earth, the films seem to be focusing on that larger tale and trying to make their story one of equal standing to The Lord of the Rings, when in reality, The Hobbit works precisely because it is a smaller, more character-focused, and self-contained adventure story. And there you go, because that's the same thing we get when it comes to the Second Age. And what Amazon is trying to do, Amazon is trying to tell us this overall grand story, right? And they've admitted as much, trying to tell us this overall grand story where you have Galadriel and Sauron and Elrond and the Númenóreans and the establishing of Mordor, and you even have Harfoots and Wizard, the quote unquote wizard who's more than likely going to be Gandalf or Radagast. And they're trying to sort of elevate that story. Whereas if you've read the Silmarillion and a lot of the Second Age stuff, a lot of what Amazon is trying to tell you are smaller stories, right? Smaller stories. Like the Fall of Numenor is a story in and of itself. And when I say smaller stories, what I mean is, whereas The Lord of the Rings is this grand epic fantasy tale where like the world is at stake, right? The story of the Fall of Numenor isn't where the world is at stake. It's where Numenor is at stake. And yes, there are far-reaching implications for the greater world of Arda that come out of that. But ultimately, the Fall of Numenor is about the fall of Numenor, okay? It's not about the defeat of Sauron. It's not about the war with the Valar and Morgoth. It's about the fall of Numenor. And so you could make the argument that a lot of the stories that take place in the Second Age are more intimate in scope, right? They're more intimate in scope, comparatively speaking, to the Lord of the Rings, which is exactly what they're saying here with was the problem with the Hobbit films. Now, I do agree that the Hobbit films should never have been a trilogy, but again, that's where when you have Hollywood executives, inserting themselves and making decisions that maybe directors or screenwriters hadn't necessarily wanted to do. Anyway, I digress. The quality of the films. Well, we know this applies to the Rings of Pewter already. This approach to adapting the story of The Hobbit is only one of the reasons that the Lord of the Rings prequel trilogy isn't as well regarded as the original films. More broadly and directly speaking, the Hobbit films just aren't nearly as good as the Lord of the Rings. Same thing with the Rings of Pewter. While there are certainly great aspects about the films, such as the excellent cast, the trilogy as a whole fails to leave the same kind of impact on the viewer as its predecessor trilogy. There were a lot of moving parts to the Hobbit films, and the production of the movies was significantly more rushed than The Lord of the Rings had been. That is true. While Jackson and his team had years of pre production to prepare for The Lord of the Rings, they did not have the same kind of prep for The Hobbit, for a variety of reasons that range from industry disputes, just like what's going on at Amazon, to director changes, which is what's going on at Amazon, and more. The production process for The Hobbit was a lot more rushed than it should have been. Because of this, there simply wasn't enough time to put the necessary detail and care into the films as was needed. Scripts were often being rewritten on the day they were shot, and schedules were constantly shifting. On top of that, the Hobbit films weren't even initially intended to be a trilogy. The Hobbit was originally meant to be 2 movies, and much of the pre-production was completed when this was the plan. However, the decision was made late into the production to split the story up even further and make 3 films instead of 2. This added even more stress and chaos to the film's production, which isn't necessarily a recipe for greatness. As a result of all this, the Hobbit movies were a bit of a mess. They were not nearly as well received as The Lord of the Rings. The reactions from diehard Tolkien fans and general audiences alike were pretty mixed. While it was great to revisit the world of Middle-earth on screen, the overall story that was presented was not nearly as compelling as The Lord of the Rings, and ultimately fell apart in the final chapter, the Battle of the Five Armies. On top of that, the prequel films' overuse of digital effects as opposed to the focus on practical effects in the original films made the movies feel much less tangible. At times, the experience of watching The Hobbit feels more akin to a video game than an actual movie. This isn't solely the fault of Jackson, the visual effects teams, or anyone else involved in The Hobbit's production. Rather, it's the result of a rushed, frantic, and unnecessarily complex developmental journey for the films. These behind-the-scenes issues bled through into the movies themselves and ultimately stopped them from being as great as they could have been. All right, and that was from author Kyle Kriska. All right, so yeah, as well as Jackson being brought in late into what was going on. He was not originally the person in charge. They had someone else at the helm, and then that person left, and then Jackson was brought in. So yeah, I mean, to go on about what they're saying. Yes, when you have studio executives that are making creative decisions, you will inevitably run into issues like this, right? Like I said, I know for a fact, I've seen the documentaries and a lot of the behind-the-scenes stuff. The entire love story between, I believe the dwarf is Fili, and the elf maiden, Toriel, Toriel. That was entirely created. Don't look for that in Tolkien's writings. It's not there. Actually, it goes against a lot of what Tolkien wrote, i.e. an elf and a dwarf being in a romantic relationship. But that was entirely crammed in there because studio execs said they wanted something to quote unquote bring in the young girls. Right? They wanted something that they could market to young girls, very, early teenager, 13-year-old girls, a sort of love story, a romance, and that they felt that that's what they wanted to do. Now, the whole, sexist aspect of that, like assuming that like, oh, well, if you got to throw the young girls a bone, so let's give them some, half-cocked fucking, romance between a dwarf and an elf, put that sexist idea aside, the girls couldn't have just been interested in the story itself, and fighting orcs, right? You got to give them like a romance story in order to make them happy. But that being aside, Peter Jackson and them did not want that in the film. Okay, it was a point of contention between them and the executives, and the executives ultimately being the ones that control the money, got their way, and we're like, no, we are putting this in the film because we need something to appeal to a young female audience. And so, according to all of our analytics, that means, romance story. So make a romance story. And that's how you got the Toriel and Fili romance aspect of the Hobbit trilogy. I know, like I said, other things, they are correct. You had changes that were being made and being requested by executive producers and stuff like that all along the lines, to the point where it was causing them to have to adjust the script on the day of shooting. So the way it usually works is you have a shooting schedule, and you go through the script and you say, all right, well, all the scenes that happen in, let's just say, a region, right? Let's just hypothetically speaking, all the scenes that happen in a region, whether it's early in the first movie or if it's in the last movie towards the end of the movie, while we have all the actors and everybody on the Aregion set for, let's say, that 2 week period, we're going to film everything that happens in Aregion while in that 2 week period, while we have all the actors and everybody on set, or have access to the set. So we're going to schedule it like that to make sure that everybody's there so we can get all the scenes of Region filmed. Well, if you're constantly changing the script on a day-to-day basis, you're changing your shooting schedule on a day-to-day basis, right? Because you may add more scenes to, say, Erebor or Region, just hypothetically, that you hadn't factored in a month ago when you had everybody on the soundstage, on your Erebor or Region set. Okay, and now you're adding scenes to the script that weren't initially filmed. You have to go back and do reshoots, right? And so it's all these little things that build up. And so, yes, I'm not saying that Kyle is wrong as to where the Hobbit trilogy comes up short from a strictly behind the scenes technical aspect. But what I will say, I will stick to my guns and say this is a lot of the same things that you're seeing happen with the Rings of Pewter, right? You're seeing them skimp on costumes. So what you get is it's supposed to be like the scale mail, chain mail stuff. But if and you can find them online, people have, paused and taken screenshots where you can see that it's literally just a pattern, painted onto what looks like leather. Right, so it's not real chainmail, it's not real scale mail in some of like the Numenorians' armor and stuff like that. It's literally, it looks like leather or some faux leather, and they just had a pattern and they just sort of spray painted the pattern to make it look like it, right? Or you get other things where you'll see like the visual effects team, it'll supposed to be a scene, particularly that one where Bronwyn is giving the inspirational speech to the Southlanders, and they're all gathered around, and she's up higher on, it's towards the latter half of the season, and she's up higher on this sort of like stage or like overlooking and trying to give them this inspirational speech. And you can see that what they did was they filmed about 8 or 9 actors standing together, okay, and just filmed them from different angles, and then just copy and pasted to sort of fill it out and make it look like there were, a couple of hundred people there, when if you actually pause it and you look, you can see that it's the same group of people copy and pasted throughout the scene, right? And so you get a lot of that when you have executives and higher ups calling your shots. And that's not even to discuss when you're talking about casting and you're having to meet Amazon's criteria of, their diversity criteria, which they do in fact have. And I've pointed it out, and, you can look it up for yourself. Just go to Amazon Film Productions or Amazon Video Productions or Prime Video Productions, and they have it. It's right there, right at one of the first pages. It lets you know that there is diversity criteria that all productions from Amazon have to meet, both in front of the camera and behind the camera. Okay, so I mean, when you factor all of these things in, all it does is it hinders your production because you don't have necessarily the best people on the job, because you're saying you have to have X amount of this group and you have to have X amount of that group. And then that's not saying that people from different groups can't be the best in their field. Obviously they can, but when you're forcing it, what you're not getting the people that are bringing the best to the table, you're getting the people that are meeting your requirements. Okay. And that's always going to give you, it's going to set the bar lower in terms of quality, right? Not to mention, you get executives making decisions like, well, because this doesn't meet our policy on this, you can't have that in the show, right? So now you're affecting content of the show. Not to mention, you like have to sort of create new stuff to sort of fill in the gaps because for one reason or another, the people holding the purse strings aren't allowing you to do the creative and or adaptive things that you want to do, right? To adapt Tolkien's work properly. So you're sort of forced by corporate to follow a certain game plan. And that's always going to come through. And I think it came through in The Hobbit. I will agree that it came through in The Hobbit, and that is why The Hobbit's film trilogy, in my opinion, while it's good in and of itself, and I love the fact of going back to Middle-earth, I would say that comparatively speaking, it's not as good as the Lord of the Rings trilogy, right? That's just my opinion. Okay. But it's also why The Rings of Pewter is such a shitty show. Okay, because The Rings of Pewter takes everything that hobbled The Hobbit, okay, and amplifies it by a magnitude of 10. Okay, which is why it's even less than The Hobbit. The Hobbit, if you really want to break down to it, okay, The Rings of Power is to the Hobbit films what the Hobbit films were to the Lord of the Rings films. And that lets you know what a gap there is between the Lord of the Rings films and the Rings of Pewter. But anyway, I just thought I would share that with you. It was an interesting article because, like I said, a lot of the same stuff translates over to the current Amazon show, although the mainstream media, particularly MovieWeb, will never admit it and never say so out loud. But a lot of these same things that they're saying are reasons why The Hobbit didn't do as well as Lord of the Rings is exactly why The Rings of Pewter will not do as well as The Hobbit. Take it from there. Anyway, I'd be interested to see what you guys think down in the comment section below. If you like the video, like the video. If you feel like sharing the video, by all means do so. If you have not subscribed yet, I hope that you would consider giving the channel your subscription. We're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers before June 1st. And if you are a returning subscriber, as always, I thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a member of the Army of Beautiful Badasses. All right, folks, check out the merch link. We got merch. Got some new merch coming out soon. As well as check out the Discord link. Head on over to the Discord. We have lots of good conversations over there, lots of creative conversations about fantasy, Dragonlance, Dungeons and Dragons, writing, Tolkien, you name it. And that's all I got for right now. So I'll be interested to see what you guys have to say down in the comments section below. Until then, remember to be good, be safe, be awesome, but more importantly, stay more dorkish. Until next time, peace.